Hi, everybody, and welcome to my sci-fi, fantasy, and horror short fiction roundup for February 2021. And I got a bunch of stories as usual to get through. I'm sitting in the basement in my pajamas drinking a really good cup of tea, so hopefully this will go smoothly with no interfering birds or dogs or kids. I'm going to dive right in. So my first story pick for this month's roundup is Laughter Among the Trees by Susan Palumbo in the Dark. And I really don't know what to say about this extraordinary horror story in the dark, except that it's so good it's almost unbearable to read it. And I mean that as the most sincere compliment. In the story, we know from the very beginning that the protagonist's sister disappeared in the woods many years ago. We also know that she's now heading back to look for her sister. And as I read this story, I was gripped from the first paragraph by this hollow, strangling sense of dread. I knew, obviously, it's a horror story. I knew this wouldn't end well. And I could even vaguely make out the shape and the shadow of what had happened in the past and what must happen now. And yet the conclusion, when it comes, is so completely devastating. It's a harrowing story where the perfectly captured details of a sibling relationship serve to deepen the horror and make it bite even harder. My next story pick is The Love Song of M. Religiosa by Nivedita Sen in Kaleidotrope. Now, I didn't know that I needed to read an almost like a chivalrous love and lust story about a praying mantis, but I absolutely did. Sen's story about Mantis, who lives in a lab with a lot of other insects and who, from a distance, worships a female mantis he calls she, is a sheer insectful delight. As Mantis sets out on a quest to court and mate with she, he encounters dung beetles, various flies, spiders, and even a cat. In the background, there are some more human mating rituals playing out between the people working at the lab, but it's the insects who really seem to know what they're doing. The story is charming, it's hilarious, and it has real emotional depth. Also, I will now forever imagine dung beetles talking like the dung beetles in this story. My third story pick this month is Horangi by Thomas Ha in Cosmas Infinities number 4. Now, on Twitter, Ha describes the story as a slice-of-life tale about a boy's misguided desire for a sense of belonging, liminality as a point of connection rather than separation, and a Korean pocket of 1990s Honolulu that's more Kalihi / Makiki than Waikiki. I'm sorry for any mispronunciations. At the emotional center of this wonderful tale is a grandfather and his grandson and the deep relationship between them. There's also the fact that the grandfather is, well, let's say not all human, but an ancient creature of quite a different sort. And in this tale, his past, the grandfather's past, comes back to haunt him. This is a lovely, nuanced, compelling story about family and identity and magic. And it's also about being and becoming who you want and need to be. My next story pick is The Taste of Centuries, The Taste of Home by Jennifer Hudak in Koreo magazine. Hudak describes this story as being about Jewish immigrants in a portal universe. It's about preserving traditions, but also letting them change, missing a place you've never been, and baking challah. I felt this story in my very bones because, in so many ways, it echoes my own experience as a person who moved from Sweden to Canada in my 20s. And that phrase from Hudak about missing a place you've never been permeates this whole story about young Skelly, who now lives in this universe parallel to our own, a realm where magic and nature are intrinsically connected, the place that her grandmother settled in years ago. And Skelly loves her world, but when a visitor from grandmother's original universe, our world, stumbles into the forest, well, it brings up a lot of thoughts and feelings for Skelly. This is a gorgeous, subtle story that captures so many facets of the immigrant experience without, being blatantly about that. And there's one quote in particular from the story that sticks with me. What if I don't feel like I belong entirely to this world? I'm not sure any of us ever do. It's a choice we make to be where we are. And those lines really resonated with me as I read this story. A bit more about Choreo magazine. Choreo is a quarterly magazine of speculative fiction and migration. We are dedicated to diversity and elevating the voices of immigrant and diaspora authors. My next story pick is Fan Fiction for a Grimdark Universe by Vanessa Fogg in Translunar Traveler's Lounge. I'm just going to have a sip of tea before I continue. Now, Vanessa Fogg, you should read everything by Vanessa Fogg. She has a wonderful ability to write stories that are heartbreaking and heartwarming at the same time, and that ability is on full display here. In a very grimdark universe parallel to our own, a universe where a group of friends and enemies have battled against terrible odds, and sometimes each other their whole lives, two fighters are contemplating the end of their lives and their struggle. They're also contemplating a very strange phenomenon, that what happens in their world is somehow bleeding through into what is our world, influencing the creation of shows and stories and, fan fiction. This is such a tender, harrowing, and rich tale. And it's so meta. It's a love story. It's a war story with the whole space opera lurking in the background. And it's also this deep and nuanced contemplation of the value of stories and of telling stories and of reading them. It's absolutely beautiful. Absolutely go read it. My next story is I Let You Out by Desirina Boscovich in Nightmare. In the story, a woman waits for a monster to emerge from her closet at night. For years, whenever she's been in a room with a door, a monster has emerged, and every time she ends up running away. She's been on the run for years, crisscrossing the country, never staying anywhere for long, avoiding houses, rooms, beds, since the monster always seems to find her there, but in the end, she cannot escape its clutches. But it's what happens when she confronts that monster that really matters. It's an emotionally powerful, haunting story about fear and love, and about the monsters within and without ourselves. My next story pick is Mr. Death by Alex Harrow in Apex. And this is the opening line. I've ferried 221 souls across the river of death, and I can already tell my 222nd is going to be a real shit kicker. This story is brilliant, heart-wrenching read that tempers its harrowing and emotionally devastating core plot point that one of the angels of death is sent out to get a baby, with a great salty dose of foul-mouthed, obstinate, straight-talking humor of the darkest and most desperate kind. Harrow is a brilliant storyteller, and trust me, You will want to read this one to the end. My next story pick is also from Apex. It's Gray Skies, Red Wings, Blue Lips, Black Hearts by Merk Fen Wolfmore in, yes, again, Apex. And this is a dizzying, dark, razor-sharp story set in a city where dread and fear stalk the streets and buildings, where demons devour the unwary, where souls can be dislodged and stolen, and where the decay and darkness of the city itself is a shadow world, basically existing below the closed-off world of prosperous above. Wolfmore has packed a dark fantasy slash horror epic into the space of a short story, and the intricate gleaming threads of world building create a weft and warp for a lyrical, devastating story about redcap kestrel, wind chime owl, and the memories that harrow and haunt them. My next story pick is Lagoon Fire by Francesca Forrest, which is published by Annorlunda Inc. And if you've read Forrest's fantastic novella, An Inconvenient God, you're already familiar with this world and the main character, Decommissioner 37. So I'll read you the blurb for this book. I think it's a novelette. Decommissioner 37 is not the most conventional decommissioner at the Ministry of Divinities, but she takes a role of helping fading gods to retire seriously and feels bad when things go wrong. Take the decommissioning of Lagoon Fire, former god of warm ocean waves. She botched that somehow, and now he spurts salt water when upset. When seawater invades a development project in Lagoon Fire's old haunts, suspicion naturally falls on him. But is the retired god the source of the problem, or is it the work of a mortal saboteur? Searching for the answer to these questions brings 37 face to face with a past you'd rather forget. Yes, like I said, if you've read An Inconvenient God, you are on familiar ground. And I just love this story. It's so wonderful. Like it has this sort of gentle, cozy feel, even though it's a very like intricate and gripping story. It's almost like a cozy fantasy mystery, I guess, and it really appeals to me because there's all this intricate world building that is so effortlessly incorporated into the story, and the characters are just so wonderful. You want to follow them everywhere. It's an amazing read. My next story pick is When Your Being Here is Gentler Than Your Absence Hard, and it's by Philip Haidar Tronovsek Zorko. Sorry about the name, my pronunciation of it rather, in Beneath Ceaseless Skies. In the story, a fighter is sent back in time to save the future and to save the woman she loves, or rather, will love. She's armed with a magic sword. She defeats one assassin, but that is not the end of it. She must also convince her lover-to-be of the danger that is approaching and what to do about it. And I love how this story takes a time travel plot and weaves in so much magic and emotion into it. Both this world and the characters in it are vivid and compelling, and the whole thing is a riveting ride because things go bad very quickly and there seems to be only one way out. Or is there? A fantastic read from one of the best fantasy zines in the business, Beneath Ceaseless Skies. My next story pick is You Will Survive This Night by Indra Pramit Das in Come Join Us by the Fire, published by Tor Nightfire. Now, that's a story about what happens after an assault takes place at a house party in Kolkata, India, is just a dark, harrowing scream of a story. It captures that heady, vaguely ominous vibe, at least I've had at some parties I've been to, that feeling that something terrible is happening just out of sight or will happen just out of sight. But here, the horror of the assault is followed by some truly spectacular immediate retribution and the after effects of a very particular curse. You can pick this story up by itself, but it is part of the anthology, and a bit more about that anthology. Come Join Us by the Fire. Season 2 is the second installment of Night Fire's audio-only horror anthology, featuring a wide collection of short stories from emerging voices in the horror genre, as well as longtime fan favorites. And my next story pick is A Test of Trouble by Catherine George in Luna Station Quarterly. And it has one of the best opening lines I've read in a long time. The opening line is, "When the baby is 9 weeks old, Bree begins to suspect she is a time machine." Now, if that's not a brilliant hook of a first line, I don't know what is. And what follows is an equally brilliant and decidedly unsettling look at a fraught relationship. And it's also an insightful and unflinching look at the reality warping exhaustion that is often part and parcel of a baby's first few months. I love this story. And I love how there is decidedly a method to the time warping madness of Bree's baby. And I love how we slowly, over the course of the story, realize how profoundly awry things are in Bree's life, and were awry before the baby ever arrived. There are dangers lurking here that might impact not just Bree's life, but the world. I do love time travel stories, and this one is a keeper. My next story pick is The Mathematics of Fairyland by Phoebe Barton in Lightspeed. Now, here, Barton masterfully weaves together science fiction, fairy tale magic, and logic, fairy logic, with a crushing tale, really, of loss and grief. The whole story takes place on the space station Psyche Harbor, which is described as an in-between place where gardens bloom within a polished hull. And it's positioned above the asteroid 16 Psyche. And it adds a particularly interesting twist to the story because the asteroid is made of cold iron that no fairy could touch and live. Now, the protagonist of the story has lost her love, Berenice, and believes that she disappeared into the fairy realm. But finding a way to reach her and save her might be an impossible task. And this is such a gem of a story. I love science fiction mixed with fantasy, and it's done so well here. And after reading this story, I do wonder about those Martian fairies because they sound very interesting. My next story pick is The Curious Case of the Cave Salamander by Gwen Katz in Utopia Science Fiction. And if you need a joyful, sharp-witted romp of a story that involves a strange new species of salamander and the shenanigans that follow after this salamander becomes famous, well, then you must read this tale by Katz in Utopia Science Fiction. The salamander shenanigans are brilliant, and so is the quippy dialogue and the twist at the end. I was utterly charmed by this story, and it's part of a wonderful issue of Utopia Science Fiction, a magazine that publishes stories that shine with a more optimistic future, one we want to believe in, one we would fight for. Now, next up is Sarah's Someone by Anna Vangala Jones in Wigleaf. And this is a ingenious story told from the point of view of a girl's maybe imaginary friend. The whole phenomenon of imaginary friends is very close to my heart. I had an imaginary friend myself when I was little, and it struck me as I read this that it's such an utterly weird and at the same time everyday occurrence that children imagine people and creatures into existence. Here, we follow the trials and tribulations of the friend, the imaginary, maybe, friend, as the world and Sarah begin to change and move away from her. It's just beautiful strangeness all the way through. Next up is The Unrepentant by Derek Bowden in Escape Pod, narrated by Iba Armankas. Now, I don't want to delve too deep into this story here because I believe it's the kind of story that it's almost best if you go into it with an open mind. I will say that it is the kind of story that made me go back for another read and another listen after the first go around. It's science fiction. People are forced into positions of service and servitude without much say in the matter, and it seems that there are no ways to real freedom for most people. But when the protagonist meets Jenna, a relationship is formed that might offer them both a different kind of future. Bowden says that he wanted to write a story about emigration and criminal injustice and love. And that's all here in all its twisted glory. And my final story pick for this roundup is This Wet Red by Mariska Pschett, a pseudopod, and it's narrated by Autumn Ivy. And I'll read a quote from the story. The next sounds make me think of the house, and the house I stayed in before, wet and full of bones. I think about the house before that, and the trailer before that house, and the apartment and the motel. Thick swallowing and the smell of silence. End quote. Now, Pschett's story is a deeply unsettling, nightmarish tale of a person who is on the run from a monster or monsters in what seems to be a post-apocalyptic world, or at least part of a world. Danger lurks everywhere from monsters and people, though there are not a lot of people around anymore. The narrator has been on the run from the monster for a long time, and they know when it's close. This story really got under my skin, and I love the way it makes reality feel uncertain and shifting, as if you might fall through into the abyss at any time. And that's it. Those are my story picks for this month. And thank you so much for listening. And you can find the whole thing in writing online at curiousfictions.com. And I hope you'll listen in or read my next roundup next month. Thanks so much.